Welcome to another episode of the Two Pad Stack podcast. I am your host, Ace. Alongside me, my wonderful normal co-host, Jake Reiser. Jake, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. I'm actually in the sunny state of Florida, so I feel like it's the very antithesis of hockey right now, as much as I'm not too far from a very successful team in Sunrise, but I'm having a good time.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I mean that seems to be where the pinnacle of all players that want to go win a cup end up right now, anyway. So, we've got a very exciting
hmm
guest today here on the Two Pad Stack. Today's guest is a true veteran of the hockey world. He's got 24 years of experience as a columnist, author, scout, radio host, and analyst. He's worked as a predictive and integrative data analyst for the EA Sports NHL franchise, while also scouting for the USHL. You could say that he's wicked smart. He's
A
the
little,
author of the author of
sometimes.
the Art of Scouting, and he's hosting the Hockey Prospect Radio on Sirius XM NHL Network Radio. And I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today, Shane. Really excited to get some of your insight on the NHL draft and prospects and the Bruins org as a whole.
Great to be here, gentlemen. Anytime. Happy to come on.
Excellent, excellent. So the topic that's at the top of mind for all Bruins fans right now is, I don't think anybody really anticipated the Boston Bruins being in the position that they're in right now. I mean, obviously there was going to be some sort of, transitionary period, once the, Patrice Bergerons of the world hung up their skates, and it was going to be, how could the Boston Bruins carry that momentum forward? Now they still had good, franchise cornerstones. They had the David Pasternaks, they had the Charlie McAvoys, they had Jeremy Swayman, who was anointed to be one of the top new goaltenders. So they had those franchise pillars in each, primary position, but man, the wheels just fell off of the Boston Bruins this year. And now they sit, with the feasibility of a top 10 draft pick in the upcoming NHL draft. So hoping to break down some of that with you today. I want to go over the top 10 kind of central scouting picks and maybe see where your thoughts differ from where central scouting has the top 10. And also talk maybe a little bit, retrospective on, the Boston Bruins reputation around the league as a maybe poor drafting organization. And I think you have some good comments on that. So
Certainly, where you want to start? You want to start with the NHL draft upcoming 2025?
let's do that. Yeah. So go
hmm
ahead. I'll just kind of just throw the top 10 prospects at you here. I'll start one by one and we'll just kind of progress. And you can tell me, I'd like to know maybe your thoughts on, the type of game that they bring to the table, what kind of a fit they are for the Boston Bruins, and if you would really, suggest them to be selected in that slot. So first off, number one right now, Matthew Schaefer from the Erie Otters. He's pretty widely regarded as the number one prospect in the draft. Where do you feel about that? Do you think that he deserves to be rated over a Misa, a Higgins, or anybody else?
Well, one of the things that's really important, I had to learn the hard way after making mistakes, is you cannot rely on consensus whatsoever. It's really dangerous to do so, particularly if you're putting together your own list, not necessarily a mock draft, but an actual draft list, because your
hmm
own priorities of what you value, what you weight. I go back and use a lot of historical data to figure out in terms of what types of players, what type of playing styles, what positions, all what type of different attributes in players end up making up them playing more than 200 games in NHL, which I deem a successful player. So that's where my list may vary. I had actually Jason Bukla comes on my show often. He's a analyst for Sportsnet, was a director of amateur scouting in the NHL, and he sort of laughed because he knew after seeing my list and talking about on our pre-draft show the type of players that I covet in those areas, and I built a system specifically for this so that when I aggregate all my information together, it actually spits an automated list out for me within ranges, and then I can move the players within the range, but I can't move them up or down. So it's predetermined in that respect. What it does is protects me from me, because I'm my biggest problem, right? So I have to turn off all the noise. So in saying that, when it comes to Matthew Schaefer and you look at him as a defenseman, how difficult it is to find a defenseman who not only has the offensive and defensive hockey sense that he possesses, but his skating ability. And I find in hockey that the game is about creating time and space and taking away time and space. Now, how successful you are in terms of production will really rely upon your hockey sense and your puck skills and your skating ability, your work ethic. But it's how much can you create and take away time and space. And as a defenseman, particularly in this era of how hockey's played, his mobility provides him a tremendous amount of time and space. So whether he's in puck retrieval and taking that puck, he's able to mitigate that F1 on the forecheck and almost get rid of that player as a pressure point. And that makes it so much easier, especially for his defense partner too as well. So he can transport the puck and move the puck, but he has enough hockey sense to understand how to make not only it's that first option, but also be able to see how the game is unfolding in front of him and take advantage of that. So he can exploit that. And he has size. He's going to be 6'2". He's going to be over 200 pounds. So not only is he a little bit above average in terms of that respect once he fills out as a man, but he has those other aspects too as well. And I haven't even talked about his puck skills. So that he has the capability of running a power play at the NHL level too as well. So when you look at that, the other part we have to consider is from an economic standpoint is scarcity. How hard is it to find a defenseman like that? Now, don't get me wrong, it's incredibly difficult to find a first line center as well. But you're trying to average out what is the most valuable aspect for your organization. Yes, they have Charlie McAvoy, but if you can have two, it just it's so much easier to build around that, particularly when you have a goaltender who's going to be around for a long time.
Yeah, and I mean, generally speaking, around the league, it does seem like NHL general managers value the position of a legitimate NHL defenseman higher than, an NHL forward. The position of defense is always highly coveted.
So it should be because they're so difficult to find, and there's a scarcity out there. And if you do trade for one or you get one in free agency, it costs an arm and a leg. So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul to make up for that. So if you can draft one, that's the advantage. And then as you get into what comes into, I'm going to take Porter Martone out of this because I'm going to talk about the three centers. So whether it's Michael Misa or James Hagan, or what I would put into this situation as well is Caleb Denoyer, and then there's Anton Frendel. So those are the four main centers that are going to be in this sort of top six. Each of them are slightly different from that respect. I would consider in terms of overall offensive ability and his well-roundedness, Michael Misa maybe I would consider probably is the top of that grouping in that respect. And then in terms of Hagen's, he's really highly offensive. Obviously size is a factor. So when you're looking at players, what's their plan A? What's the thing that they go to? And now do they have a plan B? And do they have a plan C? Because if you're in that top 5, top 10, you should have at least a plan B at minimum. Plan C would be size. So he doesn't have that. So what's his plan B? What type of player does he turn into? And I think he's more of a playmaking, quick threat, offensive, in the mind. I'm not saying that he's going to be Jack Hughes, but he's more stylistically similar to that. Yeah. And then you look at Frendel. I'm not necessarily sure if he's a first line center or not. I'd actually have him below the other ones, but certainly he's going to be has potential to be a high impact number 2. And then the one that probably doesn't get enough discussion is Caleb Denoyer, who plays for the Moncton Wildcats. So he's still a little slim. You have to grow into that body, but he's already 6'2". He is the most well-rounded of the centermen out there in terms of his capability offensively and defensively. And if you look at his profile, if you look at what Boston Bruins, the organization, covets, he's a player that, of course, would love a Michael Misa or any of these forwards, but he's the one that fits the profile for a Boston Bruin in that respect. And I'm not saying that he certainly is, another player coming out of the queue that, is a Patrice Bergeron. I'm not saying he's going to be that.
Yeah.
But he plays a similar style. It's very important for him off puck. Off puck is very important, and he's very detail-oriented, which is surprising for an 18-year-old center, particularly in the queue where they don't play the highest structure of game comparative to other leagues. So those are the players that I think would be highest on a priority list, not to discount Porter Martone, because who doesn't want a power forward, right? Every coach wants a big power forward, that can go up and down the wing and score goals for you and play greasy, and that's a Boston Bruins player too. But if you look at their needs, if your needs and the player available can converge, that's where I look at. And let's be realistic. Unless they win the lottery, if they're in the top 3, they're probably 5 to 8.
Yeah.
So who's in that 5 range? Maybe 4. I would probably suggest it's going to be either Denoyer, Martone, Frundell are probably.
What about a name like Jake O'Brien?
That's a possibility if they drop.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I wouldn't certainly have him in the top 6, but
Mm-hmm.
Jake O'Brien's a guy that I would certainly have after that.
Okay.
In that other tier. And in my groupings now, I haven't quite collected all the data yet, so it hasn't
Mm-hmm.
spit out. But as if I look my previous years and if I look at my groupings, I don't want to say he's going to be in that grouping because I don't want to force a hand. I want to let my
Sure.
data
Sure.
does what it needs to do, right? Without
Yeah.
interference from Shane. Shane, again, is my biggest problem. But he's certainly going to be in that. But he's also a player that's going to require a longer amount of time.
Mm.
So these players that I talked about will be probably a year faster in their development than the next tier. They're going to take a little bit longer to get there.
Gotcha.
I
Okay.
do
So I'm
kind of
gonna.
want to circle back a little bit on James Higgins and make a bit of a comparison because, he started out BC this year at such a torrid pace, and then it seems like the league adjusted to him and his production has kind of gone down. That's not exactly something you would love to see out of your highest projectable NCAA prospect coming out of there. And you look at Macklin Celebrini coming out of BU, same city. I know it's a different program, but who tore up college hockey and the skills have translated seemingly very well to the NHL level. Does that bring in any sort of concern on Higgins that, his production has dipped and the league kind of adjusted to his style of play?
No, one of the things that I always have to talk about is recognizing the age ranges between the leagues they play in. Like, you can't compare NCAA hockey to the CHL. The average CHL team is about 18 to 18 and a half years of age. So about 18 years and 3 or 4 months. That's the average age. James Higgins plays in a conference, not only or in college hockey in general, that's 21 and a half years. So there's a 3-year difference between the players. Now, I'm not saying like the skill set will be debatable, but you have bigger, stronger, faster, more mature, more structured players that he has to play against. He's not playing against 18-year-old kids, 18 and a half year old kids. He's playing against 21, 22, sometimes 23-year-olds. So we have to take that into consideration in that he has a much steeper learning curve and a much harder time of producing points when you have players are much more consistent, much more mature, much more structured. So the fact that if he's producing at a point a game clip in college hockey as an 18-year-old against on average 21 and a half year old, like if he was in the Ontario Hockey League, he'd be a point and a half easily, and no one would have that debate, right? So it's actually an apples versus oranges. Yes, they're both hockey leagues, but that's a really difficult. That's always a challenge of trying to weight that properly, because that's always a challenge. They're not identical leagues. They're vastly different in many respects, and that's why sometimes I think the college hockey players, as well as the European players, particularly the ones that play against men that are draft eligible, are, I think, in many cases punished unfairly for the situations they're in or the production they're in because the environment is not equal. It's not even close.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're in a vacuum and you're just looking at raw production, I mean, an NCAA, you play a lot less games. You're playing against larger men. It's a completely different apples to oranges situation. I agree. So some of the names that we talked about, and I know this isn't always an exact science, Shane, but I'm curious if you could maybe make some comparisons to current NHL players. So we already got Higgins. You mentioned, some shades of some Jack Hughes.
Stylistically, sure. I don't like to
Stylistically.
compare players, but there is some stylistical comparables.
So you also, when you were talking about Matthew Schaefer, you were talking about how he has the size, he has the skill to, eliminate that F1. I mean, obviously, the player that comes to mind whenever we're talking about this type of thing for me is going to be Quinn Hughes, Cale Makar, these types of players. Do you think stylistically Schaefer kind of matches up to a player of that caliber, when he's at his full development?
He might be closer to Jake Sanderson. He might be closer to Sanderson in terms of how they skate, how they operate within their skill sets. Because one of the things is, and I was a short defenseman, but I was slow and chirped and took penalties and nobody wanted me. But when you're a smaller defenseman, you tend to operate and develop a different way because you have to operate differently in the environment you're in. When you're a little bit bigger, you don't have to necessarily rely. You can rely upon your size in certain situations that you can't when you're smaller, especially particularly how you defend through the neutral zone and into the defensive zone, particularly
Mhm.
when you're below the circles. So that I would see stylistically, he'd be more of a Sanderson type
Okay.
of defenseman.
Mhm.
Hey, look, the Boston Bruins will take that any day of the week.
For sure, for sure. What about Michael Misa, who also is rumored to maybe be even able to go number one? 6'2" centerman, um, prolific scorer in the CHL right now. Do you have maybe a projection or a comparison stylistically for
I
him?
don't think I really have a really fair one for him,
Hmm.
although he can do everything. That's the great
Hmm.
thing about him. He has such great versatility. Is he's a dual threat. There are some times where you have a center who is so much more weighted to be a playmaker, but
Sure.
he has a dual threat ability, which makes him less. He telegraphs less of his plays, which
Hmm.
makes him much harder to defend. I would say he's probably closer to 6'1". He might not
Okay.
be 6'2", but hey, man, he might get a growth spurt, which certainly helps him. But he's like going to be an
Mhm.
average size centerman. But the hockey sense, his skating ability, yeah, he's impressive. And to go back to that, when we're comparing these type of centermen to say a Celebrini was so well rounded. That was
Hmm.
his advantage. It wasn't his offense that jumped out to me. It was off puck play.
Hmm.
So when they were saying stylistically he had some Jonathan Taves in him, that was very
Mhm.
much accurate because it was just about his style and how consistent he was off puck, right? And this is where you know Denoyer is more like that
Okay.
in that respect. And in junior hockey, and it's not a knock because look, I'm Canadian. I live in the junior hockey world as well. Is sometimes the star player is allowed to do things that he wouldn't get away with or wouldn't be allowed to do in college hockey because you just have less margin for error there. So we talk about all the time on our show about development guys or AGMs of breaking junior habits. So there's going to be some of that where Michael Misa is not going to play 23 minutes a game in pro hockey, right? But
Yeah.
they'll throw him out all the time because why not? Every time he touches the puck, he's a danger and a threat.
Yeah. So, of this short list, kind of in your top 10, are there any players that you think are truly actually ready to take a step in their first year and play in the NHL? Or do you think they all have a little bit of marination time before they're ready to contribute?
I think if Schaefer wouldn't have missed time with injury, that's a possibility. But I am super conservative when it
Hmm.
comes to having players move up into the pro ranks.
Hmm.
I always think it's a bad idea, and generally, for the most part, it is a bad idea because it's such a massive jump
Hmm.
between the two that I think sometimes what happens with and it's proven what happens with a lot of prospects because we have this narrative of first round value. Oh, he's drafted in the first round, so he must be X and he must get there by X time, which isn't fair. I look at it is where was he picked? What's the number? Because the probability scale changes dramatically.
Right.
So for me, I don't think any of them should go in the NHL next year. None of them. Not one of them. And the reason why, and Schaefer would be the only one I would have considered, but he's only played 17 games. If he had gone off and
Yeah.
played 62 games and he was healthy, then depending on the team he goes to, of course, and what they have around him, and he could be insulated, then that's a possibility. But as far as I'm concerned, send them all back to junior, send them all back to college, go back to Europe and marinate. Because I think
Yeah.
sometimes we throw them into fire way too quickly.
That makes sense. I mean, I have heard from multiple people that they believe that Schaefer was the best player on the ice whenever he was out there, whether that was he played World Juniors for Canada, correct? He was the
World
captain
Juniors
for
and got
Canada?
hurt, but he was also at
Yeah.
the CHL USA Challenge for those two games.
Mhm.
By far was the best player on the ice.
Mm.
Like there was a pretty large margin of it just made you and it's unfortunate he got hurt because when you get to see him against his peer group,
Mhm.
that's where you start to see certain attributes of separation.
Mm.
His cognitive ability to me really jumps out. Because there's different types of processing. There's adaptive processing, set processing, and set processing is great for set plays and playing defense. And then when there's chaos in front of you, and you can be adaptive and you can just figure things out at such a rapid pace and still make smart decisions, he has both. It's really rare to find players like that. So that's what really separates him, along with the fact that his skating ability just allows him to create the time and space for then him to exploit that with his hockey sense and his puck skills.
Makes sense. Now, for the Boston Bruins specifically, you had already said that they're probably going to end in that 5 to 8 range. There's been a lot of speculation around the hockey community that this draft is maybe a little shallower than most. The skill level maybe isn't quite where previous years have been.
That's fair.
Um, do you think that in that situation, the Boston Bruins would be best served by holding on to their pick where they're at? Or do you think a trade down scenario to acquire more draft capital would make sense for them as an organization?
No, I'd hold. Honestly, I'd hold. And this will be my 26th draft I've covered. And I said this is the first time I've ever said it. And I said it openly already. So I can't go, I'm not going back from it because the data appears to say what it does. And it looks as though the quality and the quantity is going to be below average. On average, you're looking at about 58, 59 players in a draft class will play more than 200 games. That's historical average from 06 to 15. And it looks like it's trending that way from 16 to 20, although there's still lots of time for that grouping to develop. And then when I look at the low water mark, that was 1999. And it was like 40, 41 players played 200 games. It was like abysmal. It was one of the worst draft classes in history. And the high water mark was 2015. There were 71. So I'm looking at that. And I think one of the main reasons for why this may end up being a lower in terms of quantity and quality is Finland is not strong this year. Russia looks to be average. The U.S. National Development Program is the weakest I've seen ever. And the USHL is not as strong as the past. So we're really banking on the CHL in Sweden for the most part. And there's less defensemen this year. Less defensemen. Like on a normal draft list, I might have 85 players on my draft list. On average, I'm around that 57 to 62 players I think will play 200 games. And there's, 15 to 20 that are 20 at least are 25 or a cup of coffee, 100, 150 games to 150 games in that range. I might get to 60 total. So I might be 20, 25% less players. So it's in that range. It was, and now it's not, I don't want to put myself into that range as like, this is what's going to happen, but the theme of the data is starting to present that way.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think, Ernie, you bring up the 2015 draft as, it's really successful. And it maybe transitions well into our next topic that the Bruins look at the 2015 draft and Bruins fans look at it and go, the mess that Don Sweeney created and, the opportunities that were missed.
Well, it
and
was
maybe
a
gets
missed
in a little more.
opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
But what I look at it, so if you look at that draft class, they still had 4 players that are, like went on to play, or NHL players, 4 out of a draft class. If you get 4 out of draft class, that is a grand slam home run. On average, you're not even going to get 2. You're not going to get 2. Most teams don't get 2. Now, what I would coin that draft class is a missed opportunity to get 2 more. Because what you could, at least, if you could have got, say, a second pairing defenseman, maybe it's a D4 and an F6, right? Guy plays on a secondary contributor on your second line. What that could have done for them is then in subsequent years, you don't have to make those trades, either give up draft capital or prospects to fill that gap, right? So that allows you, say, to continue to draft and accumulate talent, which helps you in the long term in terms of now you're going to have a greater level of push from below, right? So then when guys do venture off and retire, that there is an extra couple players. And an extra couple players doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually very, very meaningful because all of a sudden there's an age group gap that you have and you're trying to make up for that. And then you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And sooner or later, the bill comes due. And I think that's where they got caught. That's just from that year. But I think the Boston Bruins fan base would be shocked if they actually knew what their efficiency is in drafting and developing compared to the rest of the league and what the narrative is. Because I like nothing more sometimes is to blow up a narrative just by simple facts. I think it's fun because it's fun for me because I get to discover that it's not true. Now, sometimes they are true, but sometimes they're not.
Yeah, so specifically, you mentioned to me before we started recording that you kind of have this broken down into two different eras for the Boston Bruins. You know, we're talking 2006 to 2015, and then 2015 through 2020 are the two eras that we're going to kind of chat about briefly. Now, like you had mentioned, like Jake had mentioned, you know, the general reputation around the NHL community, and even with Boston Bruins fans, is that Don Sweeney and the Bruins front office are just abysmal at drafting and developing. And you know, with the Bruins at the stage that they're in right now, you know, is Don Sweeney the right guy to be the general manager? Is the scouting staff that's in place the right people to be in the room when they're facing a critical franchise decision with this draft pick that they have coming up? I'm interested in getting your thoughts on maybe some of the handiwork. And obviously, some of this predates Don Sweeney, but he was a member of the management
Yeah,
team.
he was in the
And some of
management
it's
group.
Peter Chiarelli.
Right.
So I'm interested. So tell me a little bit more about some of the data in that range from 2006 to 2015.
This season, the Two Pad Stack podcast is proudly supported by two fantastic local businesses. First, we're going to give a shout out to Earth Eagle Brewings, where great beer meets great company. With locations in both Portsmouth and Somersworth, New Hampshire, Earth Eagle is something for everybody. Whether you're relaxing in their Portsmouth beer garden or enjoying live music and trivia at the Somersworth pub, you'll be in good hands with their craft beers, epic hot dogs, and much more. And don't forget, if you're into brewing your own beer, their homebrew shop has you covered in Somersworth. And when it comes to tattooing, there's no better place than Vital Ink Tattoo in Barrington, New Hampshire. The artists at Vital Ink are all about turning your ideas into tattoos you'll love forever. The team works hard to make sure every visit is comfortable, and their dedication to making your tattoo experience fun and relaxing is unmatched. Whether you're getting your first piece or adding to your collection, Vital Ink is the place to go. Special thanks to both of these sponsors for supporting the Two Pad Stack podcast this season. Be sure to check them out and show them some love.
Well, it's really interesting. So that's the first 10 years of the salary cap era. And what I did to break down these studies, and I've been doing this since 2007. And so I use 5+ years and 200+ games for forwards and defensemen, 50+ games for goaltenders. So I had written for this, was TSN and Sportsnet back then, and I made some changes into it to move it from 160 games to 200 based on some surveys I had done with AGMs and GMs. So I've been using this model for quite some time. The 200+ games are based on behavioral economic models that I use, and the 5+ years is based on cognitive performance of the development of the human brain, primarily for young men between the ages 22, 23. At the age of 24, that's when your frontal lobe finishes developing. Some people are a little bit sooner, some are a little bit later, but that's the general age. So higher reasoning, decision making is more consistent. So that's why I gave it that 5+ years. So if you look at that, is if you take in that 10-year period, the number of draft picks, and this is just for quantity, not quality, just quantity. If you take that 10 years, you take the draft picks of every NHL team, and you calculate how many players made that games played criteria. This is going to surprise some people. The Boston Bruins in that time frame had 64 draft picks, which is low. It's well below average. You should have 70. They had 19 players that went on to meet that criteria. They're the 11th most efficient team at drafting developing in the entire league. Number 11. That's even with the 2 misses in 2015. They're 11th. Like I like to tell you, okay, who is like what's bad. So if Boston is bad at number 11th at a 29.68 percentile, what's the Vancouver Canucks at 17.74%? And only produced 11 players. And they had 62 draft picks. So the narrative that the Boston Bruins historically have been bad at drafting is not true. It's not true at all.
You heard it here, right here on Two Pad
It's
Stack.
not.
The Bruins are
Not.
good at drafting.
Yeah. Now, are they all superstars? No. But you have here's the question I always say. Somebody says, "Oh, well, that player is only a third line player, or that guy's only a number 4 defenseman." Well, what would you rather have? 0? Because there's your option. Like the bad teams get nothing. You're like I can't tell you how many millions of dollars a third line player is worth to your organization, or a number 4 defenseman. Like that's so you don't have to go into free agency to make up for it. You're not overspending. You don't have to go in the trade market and make up for that. So that's the misconception of what the Boston Bruins are. This is going to even shock you even further. So if we look at 2016 to 20, now this is still in development phase. So this isn't entirely full and done. But if you look at it, pull up the numbers right now. So from 06 to 15, and I'm probably going to take a couple more years for this to all play out because guys develop late. So in those 5 years, 16 to 20, the Boston Bruins had 26 draft picks. 8 already have made the criteria. And I think 9 is a possibility. They might get a bit squeeze out one more. They're currently first in draft efficiency. They're currently number
Wow.
one. They're now at 30.76%. So at 30% already, they're going to be in the top 8, probably. Like historical average. They're probably in the top 8 or 9 already. That's with trading away draft picks. So this misnomer that I'm not saying the Boston Bruins are the greatest drafting team,
Right.
but
right.
if you combine these two eras and say it continues to play out and they get 9 and they move up a little bit higher in the 33 percentile range, and you combine those two eras, they're probably in the top 8 in a 15-year period. So drafting and development and providence is not their problem. So if I look at it and step back from a business perspective, and I'm analyzing the organization, and what you're looking for in certain mental models is zeros, and it's the multiplication of 0. So anytime you have such a bad aspect of your organization, it can completely undermine your entire. You can do everything really well, and one aspect just destroys what you're trying to do. So what I always look for in an organization is, where's their 0? And it's not drafting, developing. That's certainly not their problem. So, and I don't think it should be. I don't think they should make any. No, I'm not saying you shouldn't make any changes. You certainly want to be able to increase your efficiency, but they're certainly not. That's not their problem, right? These are ongoing. They could incrementally improve these things. First off, obviously, this comes from an asset management standpoint.
Right.
Can't be trading away your first and second round picks all the time, because that's going to sooner. Your amateur staff and your development staff can only squeeze so much out. Especially 4th to 7th round picks. So, and I'm not saying every one of these players that have been drafted and have developed are superstars, but they are NHL players. And once again, I can go back and look at, we'll use Vancouver and Pittsburgh. Like Pittsburgh from 16 to 20 is abysmal. They've produced 2 players so far in a 5-year period. Vancouver's at 4. Like, you're talking about single percentile to 11 percentile, and Boston's already at 30. So it destroys the thought of, or the narrative in the Boston Bruins community, that drafting, developing is their problem. I think the difficulty for me looking from the outside is, when I'm doing an assessment, I have to go back and look at all their trades. I have to go back and look at all their free agency and do a cost value analysis of every transaction. So what's the cost and what's the value, and how did that play out in that respect? And based on where they are, my suspicion would be, just from a hypothesis, that their trades and their free agency, obviously more than 50% were in the negative. Otherwise, they would be higher up in the standings, right? Because one of the things that I look at, and I'm subject to this too, no one's, like, everybody in the world subject to that, is your results are only a reflection of the decisions you make. So whether it be in your amateur staff, your pro staff, your player development, your management staff, your coaching staff, your team is a reflection of the decisions you make in those rooms collectively, right? And some areas can be better than others, but that's the end of the day. That's what it is. Like, when you look at it from a business perspective, but operations is business. Like, hockey operations is a business operation,
Right.
and how efficient is it in that respect? So I like to, like, sort of peel back the onions in different layers and try to figure out, okay, what's going on here? And they swung for the fences. Hey, look, man, they were, a couple of seasons ago, they were like kicking the crap out of the entire league. And do I fault them? Like, if you're on a poker table and you're sitting with, like, pocket aces,
Yeah.
and an ace sits on flops, well, you're going to push all your chips in the middle. Hey, man, I got trip aces already. I get what they did. I totally understand. In their case, would I have done the same thing? Knowing what I know about their drafting, developing, I'm like, okay, my guys will make up for it.
Yeah, we can make up for it. Yeah.
It will make up for it long term. It won't be in the short term. It's going to might be ugly for us, but long term, I think incrementally we're going to figure it out. And that's where you know, you can go back and have hindsight, but I look at it and go, in that situation, was that the right decision? Did it work? No. Right. But you're just basically a card counter at the casino. You're trying to increase your odds of probability.
Right.
And to do so, that's what they did. That was a calculated risk. And every decision you make is a calculated risk. There's always
Yeah.
trade-offs, like in every decision you make economically.
I mean, you
And
got to play the games, right? It's not an EA Sports simulation. You got to jump in and
no,
play the
100%,
game.
because I do it. I was actually responsible for all the EA simulations from 2007 until this year. So anytime when Boston Bruins won the Stanley Cup in 2011,
Yep.
the predictions was simulated that the Vancouver Canucks would beat the Boston. This is the beginning of the entire playoffs.
Mhm.
Vancouver would beat Boston in 7 games, and I got
Damn.
totally screwed over.
Damn.
Thanks, Pete Chiarelli, for that.
I'll take that all day. I'm happy you got that one wrong at the
Right.
last
So,
minute
I
there.
mean, because I was actually responsible last year was my last year. For 18 years, I was responsible for all the player ratings in the game, all of them. The NHL, the American Hockey League, and the CHL. I was by myself. There was no team. It was just me
Damn.
by myself. Right. So it is like a really powerful simulator. However, it's no different than any other artificial intelligence or machine learning. It's only as good as the information that you put into the machine. Right. So if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. Right. So I'm not
That's
saying
just common in sales or in software in general. I mean, that's just how it works. It's always how it
that happens in life, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So it's a really fascinating narrative about when you look at the surface, it's like, oh, well, the Boston Bruins can't be good at drafting and developing because look at their team. Well, not necessarily. They tend to be slower developers. Like they're really patient in Providence, which so when things do go badly, you're unfortunately, the problem with human beings, and I am subject to this as well, is that sometimes we're too impatient to be intelligent. And that's our problem. Is
You
like
let your
patience
emotions
is
take over.
you can't, like, the difficulty of allowing your emotions to impact it, particularly your intuitive to help make decisions. It's really powerful in the beginning, but it really wanes off quickly. So from that perspective, I think what two things happened that push the Boston Bruins to where they are. Maybe even 3. One certainly was the misstep at the 2015 draft.
Yeah.
Because then they had to make up for those assets, and then going all in, and it didn't work. And when they were the best team in the league and they're pounding everybody into the ground, right? But that was a calculated risk. I didn't have a problem with that. And then obviously the Tyler Seguin trade didn't turn out to what they want, so there was some asset loss there, which hurt.
Yeah.
And then the Jeremy Swayman thing, I think, was probably unnecessary.
Yeah.
That could have just, like, publicly and behind the scenes, I don't think that necessarily helped him prepare for the season, because when he's playing at that 9-12 save percentage area, they're probably in the playoffs. They're in a wild card team, right? There's enough. There was enough there. I'm not throwing it all on Swayman, but there's enough there for them to get there, right? To even be in that fight. They're really not that far away.
I think it was kind of like a perfect storm for the Boston Bruins this year. There were so many factors that managed to just come together and form a awful situation for them top to bottom. I mean, you've got the coaching
and they're
situation.
Still a 500 team. We're not talking about San Jose Sharks, Chicago, like, awful. We're talking about a 500, like, and this is perspective of obviously how good Boston's been for the last 15 years, and with a couple dips here and there, is 500 is awful for them. Right? Let's put that into perspective. This isn't the Buffalo Sabres missing playoffs for 14 years in a row. I'm sure, and I love the town of Boston. It's one of my favorite places to visit. The place would probably burn to the ground if they didn't make the playoffs.
Oh God, yes,
right?
It would not go
years in a row. So let's put it into perspective. This isn't Buffalo Sabres 14 years missing the playoffs. This is a 500 team, and everybody's up in arms because the expectations are that, we should be a competitive organization. And sometimes when it's a good bet. These are good bets. And then the bet underperforms, but you have multiple of these, it tends to cascade in terms of, like, there's compounding in life economically. And there's a compounding that's positive and there's a compounding that's negative. And in this respect, when you have too many aspects that are compounding negative, they tend to cascade on each other. And that so when you go back and look at decisions made, you have to really clear your mind of, wait a minute, what was the bet here? Like, what was the initial threshold of what you thought the expected outcome was? What's your expected utility is what I'm referring to in that transaction, whether it be bringing in, you know, Zadorov as a defenseman or like other
Yeah.
free agencies, right? What were you expecting from that dollar return? And if everything was like ended up being below that,
Hmm.
you're like, okay, was that a poor decision, or was this was this amplified because of the other things that happened,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you
right?
have the coaching situation where Jim Montgomery seemed to have one foot out the door. He already had that backdoor agreement with St. Louis. That's my speculation. It's not confirmed or anything, but there was a lot of reports around that.
I
You've
can
got
say that I didn't, from my understanding, that didn't exist.
Okay, good to know. All right.
Yeah.
Well, so he ends up getting the axe. He goes signs the deal with St. Louis. We have a Bruins head coach interim. Joe Sacco takes over. So there's going to be some hiccups there. Then you also have Hampus Lindholm, who was arguably the best defenseman on the Bruins. I think most consistent defender on the Bruins at the beginning of the season goes down with that broken kneecap. Then Charlie McAvoy, Four Nations, ends up going down. It's just
But what do you
compounding.
like? The thing is, what do you expect is going to happen when you lose two of your top pairing D?
Right.
Uh, like then it's like you're sliding people into roles that they shouldn't be playing in,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody's trying to make up for that, which you can't do. It's not possible to do
Mm-hmm.
that. So that like I just basically you can pretty much almost reduce the win percentage by 10%.
Yeah.
If you thought you were going to be at 60, now you're going to be at 50. You're going to
Yep.
be a 500 team, right?
Yep.
Because you can't make up for that, right? That's the one of the like strategic and philosophical sometimes differences I have when I'm talking with teams about depending on the marketplace of how you strategically build your blue line or your forward group of having the traditional 1 through 6, or do you do something different where you have maybe 4 number 3s and 2 number 4s and you push it towards more of the middle. So if you do lose somebody, there's less of this massive drop off.
Mm.
Like you can't get mad for the Bruins. Like how unlucky is it? What's the probability of losing both those guys?
Yeah.
What is that? Like a 5 percentile? Like it
Yeah.
has to be in the single digit to lose both of them a significant amount of time.
Yep.
So there's also like I can't blame management for that because sometimes in life you're just unlucky. You
Yeah.
can do
And
everything right.
how could they predict both Elias Lindholm and Nikita Zadorov drastically underperforming? Maybe what they're maybe that was a pro scouting error that they had. Then they
Well, it's
expected more out of
also
those two.
how much of it is okay. So you lose players because of injury. Those players have to move up and play in a higher role, and
Mhm.
then they underperform in a role that they're not supposed to be in.
Mhm.
So then how much are you blaming those players? I'm putting you in a situation that you're not going to be highly successful in. That, you're an NHL defenseman, but asking Zadorov to play, 22, 23 minutes and match up against first lines, particularly on the road, well, that's not what he is built for.
Yeah.
He's not, right? And so my expectation is that that's going to be an underperforming. So then
Yeah.
do you blame the management and him for that? I mean, if he
Mhm.
was in that number 4 hole,
Yep.
how has that changed? Like if everybody stays healthy this year in the defense corps, does his production change? Well, logically, if you played it gamed out to scenarios, you know, 80%, he would probably be what you expected him to be.
Yep.
But life doesn't, sometimes you're just unlucky. And I think in Boston's case, when it comes to injuries, unless that's something chronic, sometimes it's just you're unlucky. And like look at Minnesota, same thing happened to them. They're getting pounded by
Yeah.
injury, and they're hanging in there. But they had a nice little cushion for that. But sometimes you're just unlucky.
Yeah. So I'm interested in getting some of your thoughts on the current Boston Bruins prospects, not necessarily the ones that they're projecting. Obviously the cupboard has been pretty slim historically speaking here, but the Bruins did do some nifty work, I think, by acquiring William Zellers in that Charlie Coyle deal. I want to get your thought. Do you have like a scouting report or any insight on what you think Zellers can do as a top scorer in the USHL?
Well, I think if he can come in and play 50 to 150 games, that's a nice addition. That's a nice addition. That's a call up player. like projecting him to be any more than that. I think
Mhm.
I'm pushing what the probability is. And I'm
Mhm.
saying that because if you look at historically, even from the players that are drafted, you're only going to get on average 58, 59 players that'll play 200 games.
Mhm.
So, like, anytime you get past, the mid second round, the probability drops like a rock. Here's a crazy stat for you: from 23 to 32, those picks in the first round. What do you think has been the historical average for a player to play 200 games?
Oh, I couldn't even tell you. I have no idea.
It's 40%. You have a
Okay.
60% failure rate from 23 to 32. So when you're asking somebody
But they're
that,
still first round picks.
no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That's where most of the mistakes are made anyway, because players are pushed in too soon, right? I don't use, like, I actually had to get away from it calling them first round picks. I'm not interested. I ask, where were they drafted? Like, what
Mhm.
pick were they drafted at? And then what organization did they go to in that respect? So, what Providence does a really good job of pushing is everybody up one rung. So, say if you are a call up guy who, like, an honest projection, he'll play you 50 to 100 games. Maybe they get an extra 50 games out of him. That's a tremendous amount of value, right? So if I look at the totality of what they've done, if you look in the last, 5 years, they've traded away a lot of picks. I mean, a lot of picks, a lot of firsts. So the talent pool is going to be obviously not as robust as it's been in the past. So the danger for them is players like Pelosi, Patois, Lysell, Lori, who is going to hit 200 games. Those players have to play. You have no margin for error. That's the
Right.
danger, right? Anytime you trade away first round, like those first round picks or even seconds, your margin of error that you build, that's built within that system of your drafting, is now gone. So then you're asking your scouting staff and your development staff to hit on third and fourth to seventh rounds, right? And the average for a fourth to seventh round is you'll get 17 players out of a draft pick in 4 rounds. That's it. That's it. So you're looking at about 12.5% chance of getting a player to play. So, like, the numbers drop like a rock, and you're asking your group to really perform some miracles. So this
Yeah.
is where a lot of their focus for development has to be on the small group of players that can push their way through. And then their latest pick with Dean Letourneau,
I was going to ask you about Dean.
the danger with, like, the concern I had with Dean is because he played in prep school in Canada. So the quality he played with and the quality he played against was poor in relation to the CHL or the USHL or college hockey. So he didn't have to face that. So he's pounding these kids into the ground. Like, they're not even remotely close to his skill set. And the concern I had is that immediate jump to college. I thought what if you're going to go the college route, he should have just played in USHL and Sioux Falls anyway, right? If you're not going to go to an Ivy League school, I didn't see the point of him going to a prep school. It's nothing against BU or BC. I mean, they're very good universities, very, very good, but
Yeah.
it's not Harvard in terms of
Yeah.
academic necessity, right? Or a
Right.
Yale or Brown, right? So, if that's the case, you should have just played in the USHL with Sioux Falls for a year. And then after drafted, I know the Bruins don't have full control over this. They can make suggestions, or you have conversations with the player.
Right.
But I really thought Dean should have went back to the USHL for an entire
Mm.
year and then went into college,
Yeah.
because 3 points, that's not
Yeah.
cutting it as a freshman. Like
Oh.
like he has this tremendous amount of raw talent. It reminds me very much of Hugh Jessamine when he was drafted by the Rangers. He's like this massive kid with this skating ability and raw talent, but there isn't enough information and data because to project him forward, because the talent pool he played against was so weak. So that's a concern. I think he's going to probably end up having to be a 3-year player. He's got to play 2 more years. Like, I can't see how you can bring him out early, particularly after what happened this year, right? So
No.
he's 2 years there, and then probably he might end up being 2 years in Providence. So he will be a draft +5. Now, I know people will get up in arms when I say that, but if you look at the history of later round first round picks, that kind of 26 to 32 range, and that most of those players are draft plus 4 anyway before they hit the NHL. So it's normal. He just may need that extra year. And the challenge that Boston has, because they haven't had a lot of first round picks and second round picks they traded away, their margin of error again is really small. So this is where they have no choice but to be patient and have no choice to like have him play 2 years in college, then probably 2 years in Providence before he's ready to come up. And I've had conversations with his development people that worked with him prior to him being drafted, and their thoughts were, look, there's a lot of potential talent here. There's a maturing process that requires time, and most prospects do. Like,
Yeah.
it's very unusual. Like, look, don't look at Pierre Bergeron or Patrice Bergeron and use him as an example. That guy is the outlier of outliers. Like, most often you go through the draft, you can cut it down as where they're in the ranges where they're picking and go, okay, he needs a year, they're 2 years, 3 years. You get down in the bottom of the first round, it's already 4 years. You get in the second round and later, it's usually 4 to 5. Draft plus 5 before they're sniffing. And that's just the way it is in hockey.
What about another guy that I watched development camp in person. I went there for the Boston Bruins, and like I said, pretty thin stuff there. A lot of invites because they don't have a lot of prospects in the system. But one of the names that kind of stood out to me, and maybe I'm kind of catching you off guard here, so no worries if you don't have a lot on him. But Jonathan Morello, he was a 5th round pick for the Boston Bruins. He looked like he had a lot of raw skill out there compared to the other players that were there at development camp.
Well, that's one of the things too, as well. When you're picking in that 4th to 7th rounds, and he was a 5th round pick, so he's going to have average size as a centerman, 6'1", couple 100 pounds, and the advantage for him as well, because he had that year in Dubuque, and it's really hard to produce points there. So it's got to be really careful with that. So he came out of Ontario Junior Hockey League, now to Dubuque, and so for me, he's a player that is going to be definitely a draft plus 5. But what you're looking for me from him is, okay, what's the one thing he's really good at, and can he build out that plan B? So he doesn't have excessive size, so he doesn't have that to lean on. So what's his off puck play going to be? Like, what is he going to develop into? When you look at him, is he a guy that could come up and be a 4th line center for you, or playing a wing on a 3rd line, or like at best, right? Is he going to give you some utility there? Because that's what I'm going to look for him. Does he have enough versatility and utility in his game to play in different aspects of the lineup? And the only way to do that is to be patient with his development as he moves on into college hockey. So that's going to be interesting to see for him. And then they can have him like maybe play 3 years, which most likely he'll end up playing 3 years in college, and then move on into Providence and play a couple years there. So you might not see him until he's 23.
Gotcha.
Get a real sniff, and that's the average.
And then he'll marinate a little bit more in Providence anyway, I'm sure.
No, and that's one thing is I have Patrick Williams on the show, who's been covering the American Hockey League for over 20 years. Like, I think he's the Bob McKenzie of the American League.
Okay.
I've traveled with him. Yes, I'm biased because he's also a friend, but he does a great job of covering the American League. And every time I've had him on the show for the last 15 years, one of the constants when we talk about the Bruins is how well run the Providence Bruins are and how good a job they do of developing players. And it's just about really what you're trying to do is just move them up one rung. Like, okay, if we project him to be a 4th line player, can we squeeze him into that F9 role, right? If he's an American League player, can we get him into the point where he can be a call-up guy consistently for us and give us 50 to 75 games? That has value, right? It's about trying to just push everybody up one rung. So they've done a good job in terms of that respect.
There's been a lot of kind of like things that I've noticed that it seems like some organizations treat their AHL franchise in a different way. And the Boston Bruins have always been focused on having the Providence Bruins serve as a development channel first and foremost. You compare that to like maybe the Washington Capitals with their affiliation with the Hershey Bears. I always feel like the Hershey Bears always are just trying to load up on AHL veterans to try to win a Calder Cup. Like,
well, no, there's a difference actually. I put Providence and Hershey in the same boat.
Okay.
They both what they're trying to do is balance two things: winning and player development. right? And they're not mutually exclusive of each other because you can have both. But what's the important thing that both these franchises do is they specifically target AHL veterans that fit into. So we'll pay you a little bit more money to stay here because living in province is nice and living in Hershey is nice compared to some other places you could live in the American League. And we're going to pay you a little bit more. And this is what we're asking of you is you're going to get called up and you're going to get some NHL money on occasion, but we want to help, lead these prospects, right? This is part of, you're not just playing hockey. These are the things that we're asking you to do. We're going to pay you some more money for that, right? Because we recognize your value to the organization. That's what the Bruins and the Washington Capitals do really well. And that's why you see Providence and Hershey be really successful franchises. So it may look like Hershey is just trying to win, but they understand that when they win, it's also really good for their prospects. And Providence, if you talk to their management group and also to the Bruins, they understand that as well. So that's why you see
Yeah.
Providence always in the playoffs. It's really important. Like as American League franchise, your team has to get into the playoffs. It's absolutely critical for your franchise for that development cycle because there's very little, if to no experimentation when you bring a young player up to the NHL. Like you got to play, you can't be fooling around, right? And you can
Right.
still have that experimental phase a little bit in the American League.
Yeah. So there's a few more names in the Boston prospect pool I want to get your take on. First off, one of the things that I've heard from a lot of people that have been following the Providence Bruins is that Frederick Brunet has taken a big step forward in his development, and he could even be maybe on the short list of names to get a call up here as the season winds down for the Boston Bruins. Have you noticed anything about him? I know that he was I think he was drafted in the second round.
Frederick Brunet
Fifth round.
Fifth round. No, so again, okay. But here's one of the things that's really interesting when I go back and look at probability in which players end up playing from that fourth to seventh rounds. He fits a certain profile, right? So if you look at him as a player, 6'3", over 200 pounds, has versatility in his game, and you say, okay, what does he have? Well, he's got size, right? So he can lean on that. Are there some other aspects of his game in terms of his versatility to come up and play, right? So that's one of the things I like about him as a player. And look, and he had a leadership position when he played with Rimouski in the Q. So that's a possibility. And I like the fact that they bring up a guy and give him a game to show him and get him practice time to show, okay, this is a taste of what you have to prepare for. You have to play at this level at what we're asking. So then you can go back and say, okay, here are the things we want you to work on. So you got to speed up your pace of game. You got to speed up your decision making, right? You have to simplify your game. Not saying, you're dumb, but you got to understand that, that first option is your best pass. Like how quickly you have to move the puck. These NHL players will be where they're supposed to be the majority of the time. It's not as chaotic as the American League. So he understands what he has to work on. I think that's really important. But also remember, he's 21. Yes, he turns 22 in August, but relax, right? He's another guy who's probably 2 more years in Providence. If he comes in, and what is he going to be? Is he going to be a role player for you potentially? Maybe, right? Yeah. But even if he plays 50 to 75 games, that's a really valued draft pick in the 5th round. That's a high level of value.
I mean, I'm looking at successors. I mean, the Boston Bruins traded away some big names, people that have been in the organization for a long time. I'm not even talking about Brad Marchand because, there comes to a time in your career where you just need to end, whether that's now for Brad, maybe whatever. That's a story for another time. But I'm talking about like the Charlie Coyles. I'm talking about the Brandon Carlos. Brandon Carlo he was the second longest tenured Bruin not named Brad Marchand. And now he found himself on the way out. So he's always been that, second pair, smothering defensive defenseman.
Yeah, he's a linchpin defenseman. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't see another Bruin on the roster that could play that kind of role.
They don't have it. They don't have it. They don't have it in the farm system, and they certainly don't have it, obviously, in their roster. I mean, will Zadorov be able to fill some of that? Sure, but maybe not at the level of that. So, this is an interesting time for them. And the advantage for Boston is that obviously the expanse of the salary cap. That's certainly going to obviously, make things easier for them as well. But that's all about being really, frugal with what you do and understanding that.
And I think they got a lesson on that just in the previous offseason with what they did with Elias Lindholm and Zadorov. So,
Yep.
last name I'm going to throw at you here from the prospect pool, and it's one that's kind of been, a little out of left field for a lot of Boston Bruins fans just because of where he came from. And that's going to be Dan's Lockmelis, who has actually had
The
a
Latvian.
great
Yeah.
Latvian kid, great production right at UMass Amherst, with 33 points in 40 games. And he was the captain for Team Latvia in the World Juniors. I'm curious of your thoughts on Lockmelis.
Well, I think what he can provide, and I've spoken to Jamie Langenbrunner about this specifically on the show, is what I like about his game is versatility. Is he can play in a bunch of different areas in the lineup. And that's really important for the coaching staff because I can put you out as like, is there potential there for that third, fourth line? And I sort of look back a little bit on players they've had in the past. We Jacob Locko, right? Where he left and now he's coming back. And can he provide something similar to that?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a possibility. Like there's although, Luck Mills is, drafted a little bit, he's not in the, the top round.
Mm-hmm.
He's a guy that I think has enough versatility and utility in his game that could potentially come up and give you 150, 200 games. He might be one of those guys that are a later round draft pick because of that, playing on the wing, playing in the middle of the ice. He has some versatility, in his skill set, and he's a worker bee. And all like Latvians are like that. They got pace and they got energy and they got willingness to I call it, there's choices and decisions in a player's game, and he makes a lot of good choices. I'm willing to take hits to make plays. I'm willing to go to the net. I'm willing to play in the ugly areas. Those are the type of players that end up having success in those third and fourth line roles. So if anybody late is going to play for them, if I had to put money on that, I'm going to go with Lockmelis.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah.
Last thing we'll do before we wrap up then is going to be matchmaker. We're going to backtrack to the 2025 draft here that's coming up. You mentioned 5 to 8 slot. You mentioned a few names here, matching organizational need, matching where they're going to be picking, matching everything. Who is the perfect match for the Boston Bruins in the upcoming draft?
Caleb Denoyer from Moncton. 6'2", he's going to end up being about 200 pounds. He's a 200-foot center, and he's the one player that I think fits everything that they look for in a Boston Bruin. Like, the organization will love him. The fans would love him as a player. Like, his off-puck play is very cerebral and very mature. And it's so surprising to see. I don't actually live very far away from Moncton, so I do get to see him play live. And I saw him at different tournaments. Obviously with the Holinka and then the U.S. CHL game, and I'm not going to say he's the next Bergeron, but he plays a similar style that I think the team will appreciate. Just be patient. Like, if you draft him there, don't expect him to come in as a 19-year-old. Like, give him some
second
time.
rounder.
Right? Like, give him a couple years because there's actually no reason to push him through.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can insulate him a little bit and not push him directly into the lineup. But, he's very well coached in Moncton, and that certainly is going to help him as well. But if I was a Boston Bruin, I'm crossing my fingers that Denoyer falls there. And look, if they move up in the top 3, great. They're going to get, a Misa or a Schaefer, of their choice.
Hagens,
or maybe a Hagens. But I'm not sure. Like, if I'm sitting in that room and I'm looking at the difference between Hagens and Denoyer, you're flipping the coin there. You're flipping the coin. Honestly. Like, I think Denoyer has that much value in an organization, particularly for the Boston Bruins of the way they play and what they look for in their players. I think he fits the bill really well there.
All right. Well, there we have it. Shane, I really appreciate you taking the time to break down the Boston Bruins franchise and the draft itself. It was great having you on again. I do hope to bring you on again at some point in the future. Maybe we'll do a draft retrospective and look toward the 2026 draft as well. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Anytime. I really appreciate it and hope we get back to the normal draft. This decentralized idea is terrible.
It seems like the commissioner wants to go back to the normal draft, so we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I hope so, because last year in the Sphere was amazing. Now, I know you always can't go back there, but You know what we should do is we should actually have the draft hosted in Boston. It's a great hockey town.
So cool.
Yeah, it would be fantastic. Hasn't been there in like almost 3 decades. So let's get her back in Boston.
Bring it back to Boston. All right, Shane. Thank you very much, and we're going to wrap the episode here.
Take care.